I'm Joanne Wilson, and this is Positively Gotham Gal. Real, honest, and meaningful conversations with women entrepreneurs about their approach to life, business, and everything in between.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. All right, fantastic. So we're just gonna chat about you.
Great.
So, hold on, what's going on here? All right, wait a second. All right, here we go. Fantastic. So, let me start here. So, tell me a little bit about your background. I mean, did you always want to go into medicine? Is that something you would, your parents were in, that you just sort of always sort of dabbled in and was fascinated with?
So since I was little, I had sort of like three loves in my life. They were children, medicine, and baseball.
Hilarious.
And the best gift I ever got in my life was my cousin was in medical school. I was 10 years old, and he brought me a real stethoscope. So it's something I always loved, and have been in my adult life now, kind of mixed them all up together, which is kind of a nice thing.
Well, that's one thing that's nice. That's one of the nice things about getting older. All the dots always, you can make them connect.
Yes. Had someone said it would look like this when I was little, I would have said, no, that's not how it's going to look. But it's how it looks, right?
Exactly. So who's your baseball team? Who are you a fan of?
It's always been the Yankees.
Always been the Yankees.
Through the good times and the bad times, right?
I mean, all these New York teams are just, they can torture you.
Yes, yes. I have been tortured at times for sure. And it's brought great joy at times too, right? So it's
totally. So were your parents doctors, or did you know?
No, my parents were, both of them were big lines underwriters, insurance underwriters. My dad worked for Lloyd's of London and AIG. My mother did actuarial work before we were born, my brother and I, and then went back into the insurance field. So my brother and I were both entrepreneurs, him young, me old.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that they taught us were two things. One was that you can do anything you want to do. And they helped us do that. They came way out of their comfort zone to help us do that.
Which is super cool. And what does your brother do?
My brother's an aerospace engineer and invented something really young in his 20s, which he ended up, going on every satellite that's up there has this thing on it. And he basically sold the business and then went to Juilliard and studied music, which is a very kin to that kind of science engineering.
Yeah, that's great. So both in the science. I mean, I know growing up, I was obsessed with medicine. I used to look forward to the, medicine that was in the paper once a week. I was obsessed with Joe Gannon and,
Oh my God. Yes, that's right.
I was like,
I forgot about Dr. Joe Gannon.
Dr. Joe Gannon. I was like, I'm going to be a brain surgeon. I mean, I was obsessed with medicine. And the truth is, blood, any of that stuff doesn't even faze me. But life and divorce from my parents and not caring about school was just not going to work with medicine. Right. But it was something I was always obsessed with. But yeah, Dr. Joe Gannon, I mean, every week was a good show. And
Marcus Welby.
Marcus Welby, yes. Emergency, that was another great show. So, when you left, medical school, did you go directly into your own practice, large company? What was it?
I actually had a little bit different route.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went, because I think outside the box, and that's always been true from when I was little. So my dad took me to try out for sports. He's like, she's better than everyone else. Why can't she be playing Little League or all those things? So I just always was pushing the barrier. So when I went to college, I I went to Franklin and Marshall specifically because they had such a good reputation for getting people into medical school.
Mhm.
And so what I did was I just thought about things a little differently. So when I was a senior, I applied to osteopathy school, medical school, and chiropractic school.
Okay.
They all had a different way of looking at things. And got into all three, which was great. And then took a year off and went on a journey to
Where'd you
figure out
go?
where I was going to go to school. And you know, I went to a class at the chiropractic school, and they said that it was the first day of class, and I was observing, and they said, 2 guys go out and eat chicken salad sandwiches after playing touch football on a Sunday. And one of the wives packed chicken salad sandwiches. They sat in the car all day. They ate them. One got really sick and one didn't get sick. Which one is the sick one? Now, allopathic medicine would say, you know what? It's the one who got sick, right?
Right.
But the other view of things, you know, the non-allopathic way says, well, that body should have gotten rid of that. Right? It shouldn't necessarily have kept that.
Right.
It should have known enough to get rid of it. Like, you know enough to get rid of cancer cells every day. And I was like, you know what? That's for me. I like that way of thinking differently.
Yeah.
So I deferred my admission to medical school, went to the chiropractic school for the first year. And, you know, I had a mentor who was a chiropractor and an MD. I had a great experience, stayed there, got out of school, and opened up a practice.
Mm-hmm.
Children, that's who I saw, were children with unusual things. I did more developmental pediatrics than anything else.
That's
It's a very unusual practice. And in the process of doing that, I did it for 25 years.
It's a long time.
People came from all over the world to see me. And it was a very different, unusual kind of way. And I had tremendous relationships with all the physicians in New York City. You know, so if I had a kid with an unusual thing, I could pick up the phone and call whoever it was at NYU and I had this incredible interactive practice.
And so name me like 1 or 2 things that were so unusual about these kids that people sought you out.
Okay. So for example, I saw a little boy. So my best friend growing up, we've been friends for 50 years now. That's how old I am. We met when we were high school. Her neighbor had a child. The child was 3 months old. And she kept saying to my friend Ann, something's wrong with this little boy, Luke. And she said, I took him to the pediatrician. The other pediatrician looked. I took him to a neurologist. But I just know something's wrong. Now, she's a first-time mother. They probably said, you know. So she said, you know what? Let's take him to Joan. She may not know what's wrong with him, but she will know if something's wrong with him.
Okay.
So she brought him in. I did a full exam. And one of the things you do on a full exam, which sometimes doctors don't do anymore, is you shine a light in their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be a red light reflex.
Right.
He didn't have it in either eye. So I said to the mother, you know, I've got to send him to a pediatric ophthalmologist because, you know, there's something going on with his eyes. And I think that's what you're seeing. I know when you don't see the red light reflex, it maybe means a cataract. Sure enough, he had bilateral cataracts. And he turned out to have a premature aging syndrome like progera.
Wow.
So that's the kind of thing that I did, you know.
That's very cool.
So I was able to pick up the phone and call Edwin Rabb at Mount Sinai and say, I've got this kid, this is what's going on. He's, you know, he saw him and he took care of him. He did the cataract surgeries for him. So
That's
those
really
were the kinds of the things that I saw, you know, over 25 years. I had people from overseas come over with all kinds of functional disorders.
So you really have, in many ways, I mean, certainly you've got the training, but you've got great instincts.
Yeah, yes. That I think that my sort of looking at things and knowing that things are not okay is what it's a blessing and a curse, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So
Yeah.
like I was in New Zealand and they took me to the university hospital to see this child who was failure to thrive. And, I looked at the child, listless, NG tube, looked at the case history. There was nothing in there. MRI everything was normal. Well, how could that be normal and have this listless kid? We're missing something.
Right.
There's that piece. And so I examined, I was actually her, and it turned out that she had severe overlap of her suture. And so it was locked here. The minute we started to manipulate that or move it, she started to suck. So when the bones overlapped during birth, they didn't undo. So she had it snipped, and I still get a Christmas card from her.
That's amazing.
But that's what I did.
That's extremely cool. I mean, I know, and I'm sure you probably read it too, but in that piece the New York Times does every week, and others do, Washington Post, I read the one in the Times usually. But when someone comes in from a very different perspective, it just changes everything, because which is why I've always liked hiring people that aren't necessarily in the industry, because they take a different look at everything else.
Exactly. And that's how, so when I was in practice, these children started coming in late 80s, early 90s with things I had not seen for the last, sort of 6-7 years when I started practice. No eye contact, delayed speech. Turned out it was the beginning of this kind of autism, thing.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think more about autism. I mean, since you saw that from the very beginning.
Right. So the thing that was most interesting about it was that the children were all a little different. One didn't speak, one spoke in gibberish, one spoke repeating what you said, called echolalia.
Hmm.
But they all had impairments in those areas. And it was unusual because most diseases and most syndromes have the same sort of symptoms, and they have the same trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
This was all different. These kids were really different. But after, a couple of years of taking a lot of case histories, what was interesting to me was what they ate was more similar than their symptoms.
Huh.
And I thought, just like you just said, like, how could it be that mothers come in and say, oh, he eats a white diet, he eats a tan diet. It's all food that was really high carbohydrates and low protein. And so I kept thinking, what is that about? So I took, 9 children and did full testing on them, that anything could have to do with protein in their bodies. And it turned out these initial children had low levels or were missing an enzyme that actually digests protein.
Well, that makes sense, right? So that they're not, right, so that their bodies are dying for protein.
Right. They don't digest it. And if they eat it, it becomes like a rancid piece of meat in their stomach, and it gives them upset stomach and other things. So they avoid it. And that's how this whole other piece started. My brother, who was the inventor, says to me, so what's new? And I said, well, I found this kind of funky thing. So what do you mean? I told him. He said, you have to patent that. I said, patent that? Well, what do you mean patent that? He said, well, do you think it could help the kids? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, you know what? If it doesn't have a monetary value, no one's going to pay attention to it. He said, you have to develop this and see if it can work.
Good advice.
So I put my first patent in 1999. And I then went back to school. Mass General and Harvard have a joint program with the institutes at Mass General.
Mm-hmm.
So I did all the coursework there for a master's in clinical investigation, where I learned how to do a clinical trial, all of those things, and eventually left my practice after, using my retirement money to pay for patents and all
Right.
that, I didn't have a company, right? I do it myself. And then started the company in 2007.
That's amazing. I mean, just talking to you, you have this entrepreneurial spirit, which in that sings to that you look at things different, and you've always broken glass. And so I can't imagine that you would do well in a corporate environment.
No, and I've never had to be in a corporate environment, which is a great blessing, right?
Yeah,
So
me neither. I mean, I was at the beginning of my career, but like not for me.
right.
Yeah, definitely
I
not
just
for
do
me.
things a little differently, right? I just do
Right.
things, I look at things differently, and I do them differently.
So this is when you really started Curemark. And, funding for women has always been difficult, but also, in the world of biotech, it is different because you actually have a product that you can show to people on the other side of the table that even if they don't understand it, there's data around this.
Right.
So who did you go and raise money from? And like, what was once you started getting these patents and realizing you had something?
Right. So I went into Curemark with like 2 or 3 patents,
Mm-hmm.
and like 1,500 kids worth of data, where I could show that like 2/3 of these kids had this deficiency, all done by outside labs. And so I had that behind me,
Mm-hmm.
but it was still an out of the box concept. You're going to treat something in the gut for the brain, like that gut brain thing today is not so far-fetched, right? With all the microbiome and all of that.
No,
But back then,
great to see, that we're like moving into people looking us as in singular individuals about our healthcare.
right, exactly. So, it was people that I knew who started. My best friends wrote me a check and said, here's $200,000, leave practice and just go do this.
Amazing.
And we've been able to raise money. There's no venture capital still in autism treatment like this, drug treatment. So it's hedge funds and family offices and high net worth individuals. It got more, sort of corporate as it went along. But we've raised almost $200 million, I should say.
I was going to say, wow.
$200 million. And we've done a lot of clinical trials. So we're excited about where we are.
So what does it mean that you define it as a socially driven biotech company?
So I think that it's interesting. So people look at children, when children are sick,
Mm-hmm.
people are not so, they're not jumping to help them the way they would an adult. So the never having gained function is not the same as having lost function.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone develops Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, there's way more research money than autism or other things. So it's an interesting sort of way that we look at things. We look at loss of function as sort of a big deal, and never having function, not such a big deal.
Well, what's interesting about that, and I've never understood this, which is when you look at the dollars that are spent in the end of life, which could be more money than you have spent on your entire medical history of life.
Right.
That money should be spent in the first 8 years of your life versus the last 2 years of your life.
Right.
And so, and I actually had this conversation with our senator, which is, I think when everyone hits 30 years old, they should have to fill out something of how they want to live in the last years of their life, because at that point you're thinking with your brain, not your heart. And when you get to there, the decisions that some people make, I just don't think are great. I mean, I'm sure you read the book, Being Mortal, and I think everybody should read the book.
Yeah, there's a lot that we don't know. And, it's like, even in this whole pandemic, people are trying to get certainty out of things that we just don't know.
No, we do not. So what are your thoughts about autism? I mean, there's been this whole insanity in my opinion of, anti-vaxxers, or, this is all caused by when you get a vaccination for all of the things that you get as a young child. And, it has been proven it's not true. There've been some tests saying that men have old sperm. That has something to do with, autism. Why? And just like we've seen new type of cancers that have come out of nowhere, like glioblastomas, it's so like you fix one, another one comes in. It's just evolution, right? We don't have polio really anymore, and we don't have diphtheria, although, we could have it come back if nobody gets vaccinated.
Right.
So, what are your thoughts on all of that?
So I've never bought the anti-vax piece, right? Because I had children in my practice who were completely vaccinated, completely unvaccinated, and every combination in between, and it didn't seem to have an effect on autism. I never saw a kid get a vaccine and then come with autism.
Right.
Some parents described that when they came in to see me, but I never actually saw it in front of my face.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we have changed the epidemiology of children in these last many years. So for example, children now are exposed to other children at a very young age.
Oh, yes.
So not like when I was going to school, maybe you went to nursery school. I didn't go to nursery school. I went to kindergarten and on. Now kids are, like 3 months old and they're with other children.
Yep.
So the epidemiology of how they're exposed to illness has changed.
Interesting.
So there's that piece. And so like early when this started, when I was in practice, there was more autism in Lower Westchester than there was in Upper Westchester or the South Bronx. And, of course now it's changed some, but I kept thinking, why would that be? And I think that when you have parents that maybe live here or lived in Lower Westchester, two parents, they work, they have their children in daycare or in school, and then the child had to be medicated if it got sick. So every time the child got sick, in order to go back to daycare, it had to have medicine. So it changed how we treat children in an everyday way.
Interesting.
What they eat, all of those things are all sort of part of the change. They have play dates. They don't go out and play on the street with their friends, right? Or ride their bikes, or everything's arranged. Everything has to be, calibrated. So like you have to constantly be attending. All this ADHD, yes, there's some real ADHD, but because everything is attending, not every child has that ability to be at school all day, attending to school, and then go to a dance class, and then go to tutoring, and then go to this, and then go to that. But I think everything's changed.
Yes, it has. And part of me is like, is it the media? Is it just different generations? I mean, listen, I've been a very liberal parent with giving massive long leashes. And also, if it dropped on the floor and it was like under 30 seconds, you could still eat it, and so it's fun. It's a 30-second rule, and the truth is, none of my kids ever got sick, knock on wood, right? And I could care less if they went out and ate dirt. I figured it'd be good for them in the long run. But I do think that whole craziness with like wiping their hands at 3 months old with these things so they don't have any dirt on them, it's just like, well, then how do they build up immunities?
Right, exactly. That's right.
And so it's all connected.
You have to live in the world, right? There are parents who keep sugar away from their kids until they get to school, and then there's cake, and then there's this, and then there's that. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I think that the extremeness of it all, and I also think there's some genetic component to autism, right? I think that a lot of the kids that I saw with autism had some OCD type conditions in their families.
Yeah.
And so
that
I
makes
think that
sense.
there's that piece there as well.
Yes. Well, the sugar thing, I would always say, I would call it the Oreo factor. If your kid goes to someone's houses and find Oreos and you've been keeping them all these years, that is not going to be make for your children bringing their friends over in later years.
Right.
So, you know, as you have now, how many people work for you in your company?
About 15.
And you're about to release a book.
I'm about to release a book.
And so how did you decide to start on that project? And when did you start writing? What is it about? Is it about your journey? Is it about autism? Is it about all the things that you've done?
It's about none of that.
Okay.
So I think that I do a lot of I sit on a bunch of not-for-profit boards, including Springboard Enterprises, where they mentor women entrepreneurs.
Love.
Right?
I love them. Yes,
Yeah.
they're fantastic.
Right. And I'm on their board, and I've learned a lot through this process. And when I boiled it, and I wrote throughout these 10, 15 years, I would write when I learned something. Like, for example, I would go to a meeting early on, and they would pay more attention to my male intern than they would to me, right? And or whatever. And my brother, who's just, he's great, he says to me, I was like, Jay, like, what the heck? What's going on? And he said, you know, they're mistaking your kindness for weakness. Said, you go in, you know, you don't have heels on, you're dressed in, you know, in business wear, but it's not like what they're used to at the banks. And you give people you hug everyone. And they don't get you. They just think, oh, she's nice and she's nice. And he's like, they don't get how strong you are. And so you use it to your advantage.
I mean, I can't tell you countless entrepreneurs that appear to be demure, but the reality is they're not.
Right.
And it doesn't come across in these meetings. And, you know, it is so frustrating to them that they have to behave in a way that is not normal or feels like simple, that when they go into these meetings so they can show that they know what they're doing. And men have not had the same experiences.
I'm authentic. They're not used to that, right?
Yes, me
What
too.
you're talking about.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And so it's about, don't let people mistake your kindness for weakness. You know, I believe very much in, if you concentrate too much on exactly what you're doing, you'll miss the periphery. And there's actually a physiological analog for that. So if you use your peripheral vision, you can extrapolate what's in the middle. So if there's a blind spot there, you can extrapolate. But if you concentrate on the middle, you cannot extrapolate the periphery.
Totally. It's like being, you know, in the clouds. You see everything down below.
That's right. Exactly. And that's true of our real vision. And so being able to do, like, for example, my not-for-profit work that I do in these boards helps me in my everyday life.
Yes.
I get exposed to people. So the book is about that. It's about change, about what's the landscape of change? What are the impediments to change? And how do you effectuate change?
Well, if we listen to the conservatives, we'd still be driving horse and buggies.
Right. That's right. Baking bread at home. Yes, I get
Yes.
that.
You know, and churning the butter. So what's the name of the book?
You know, that's a really good question. We're in the process of figuring that out now, because it's about change. And so, you know, it's like
Change wins. Change is good.
Yeah.
Change always wins.
Yeah, it always wins. Right. Change always wins. And
Change
I think
always
that
wins.
not being afraid, teach people how not to be afraid of it.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, I love change. I have no problem with change. I embrace change. If I change wrong, I change the next day down another path. But I agree with you, most people, that is extremely uncomfortable.
Right. That's right. And, you know, both my parents were, as I said earlier, underwriters. So they always told us that you can always manage risk. Risk is just something you need to be managed, not something to be avoided. right? And so with that mindset, you say, okay, I'm going to go down this path. This is the pros and the cons that at least I know of. And then you go, and if that doesn't work, you go another way. But risk is just something that needs to be managed and not be feared. And how you need to be authentic. That's what it's all about that.
That's
It's
awesome.
about doing away with shame. Shame will, basically undo you as you're trying to be an entrepreneur, right? You start hiding things or you start being afraid of things, it's problematic. So
yeah, you have to be transparent.
Right. And I do so much mentoring, when I have time, that's easy for me just to give this to someone and say, like, look, this is chapter 4 is all about, don't let your people mistake kindness for weakness, or understanding that things are just going to be different. They're just different.
Right.
And
As
the pandemic
everybody is.
Yeah, exactly.
And has this pandemic changed the way that you have seen patients, and particularly patients that are suffering with autism or any kind of neurological orders?
So, so of course I don't practice anymore, but in our clinical trials, I was in Qatar just as this was breaking out here. So I came home from Qatar in the beginning of March.
Okay.
And we have, suppliers that the owner is in China. So people were in China in January and they were talking about the pandemic there.
Oh, yes.
I go to Qatar and it's coming there. So I got home and I said to my team, okay, 2 things. One is you send our kids who are on the clinical trial 6 months of drug. And I want you to pay everybody here 2 months of salary. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I said, we don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know whether our supplier, the people who manage the clinical trial supply of the drug are going to shut down. They're a big manufacturing group, right? Who knows if they're going to shut down? I don't want my kids to be without their drug. And what if the banks close? 9/11, the banks closed.
Yeah.
Right. So I said, you know what? I just want to be, they thought I was crazy. And then of course we weren't so crazy.
You weren't so crazy.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. So, were there any silver linings through this pandemic in regards to, all the clinical testing that you were doing?
I think that we understand now. I mean, everything was done electronically in terms of the data capture, but it was done in the doctor's office. So we had to transition that to the home, which we were able to do. And we're in a long-term trial now. The kids are done with their double-blind piece. And so being able to give them the drug and understand that we were ready and all of that stuff, just underscored how, good the team is, how we're thinking about this. And, now we're getting ready to submit to FDA, and, and there's a big manufacturing piece that has to be done.
Right.
And everything is much slower in that sector. So when we send out, so for example, when we move our product from one piece of manufacturing to another, we have to send it out to be tested. What took 2 weeks now takes 4 or 5 weeks.
Got it.
So everything is slower and we have to adapt.
And now that you're moving into the FDA piece, what exactly is the Curemark Discovery that you have created, that you are now going to have hopes, fingers crossed, some kind of medicine that can be distributed to the patients that you saw?
So what we know about autism is that children with autism make less serotonin in their brains between the ages of 0 and 5 when you need the most of it.
Okay.
You get 90% of brain growth during that period of time. And serotonin, as much as it's a neurotransmitter, it also helps to make brain tissue. So you need that. There have been studies done that show that children with autism make only 60% approximately of the brain serotonin compared to a child that doesn't have.
So by the time they get to be 5, when their brain should be fully developed, they're far from that.
We believe that that's part of the mechanism here. So the enzyme frees up amino acids. So the reason why you have enzymes is it breaks down the protein into amino acids that you can transport. Amino acids that you take like from the, GNC or something aren't readily available to your body. So when you take food and you eat it and you break it down enzymatically, you have amino acids that are transportable and usable in the brain. So what we believe is by giving these children the maximum enzyme, right, to get the most amino acids from their food, then they have a greater chance of making serotonin in their brains in that critical area.
Time period.
Yeah.
And in the post of the 5-year-old, once your brain is completely at its 90%, is a big of an issue, or is it depending? I'm sure it depends on the kid.
I think it depends on the kid, right? And so we saw changes in those children as well, from 5 to 9. Took longer for them to get those changes, but we had some pretty profound results in the very young kids that we saw.
That is really amazing. And are other companies working on this? I mean, there has been such a brouhaha over autism, and also about other things like people that are on the spectrum and things that we never talked about, right? But like, I definitely have a couple friends I'm sure are on the spectrum, right? But it served them well. It wasn't that they weren't able to communicate with others or hug others or love others. It's just that, they're a little different.
Exactly. And I think that, there are a lot of people like that are not diagnosed, who are on the spectrum and who have found their way, in life. And they have special gifts, some of them, right?
Yeah.
So there are individuals with autism who are used in cybersecurity, who look at code. They could pick out irregularities in code.
It's been amazing. I mean, I know a woman who had a nonprofit and her child, severe autism, and all of these kids were like brilliant at spending hours on computer in code and fixing things. When she came home one day, he had taken apart her entire TV and then put it back together.
Yes. And it has nothing to do with cognition. Many years ago, long before Curemark, when I was just starting this, there was an article in the Times about a young man who had autism, who had an art show at one of the galleries. And they characterized the child, because he had autism, as being mentally retarded. And I actually wrote a letter and they published it saying, you know what? Our ability to measure their intellect, the tools aren't correct. So we can't use a typical IQ test to measure, what their cognition is. We have to do something different for them. So to categorize them as mentally retarded is just so far off base.
Completely. And so negative.
Yeah, right. Because they don't look like us or behave like us doesn't mean that they aren't, like us in all those other ways. Like it doesn't, we measure things by the herd, by the sameness of everything, right? And the diversity of life is really what makes it go round.
Right, which has worked obviously wonderfully for you.
Right, and I, like you, hired people with core competencies who didn't necessarily have the bias of certain things, right? And that's a way they can learn the path as long as they have the core competency.
Completely, 100%. Well, so when do you think that, because of the delays of everything happening, I mean, A, when is your book coming out? Obviously, you need to come up with the title.
Right.
And B, when do you think that this drug is going to be approved, which I would think would be game-changing for many families, as well as pediatricians across the globe who really don't know what to do here?
And you asked me earlier about impact, right?
Mhm.
So, one child with autism impacts the family,
Oh,
the
yes.
siblings, the school districts, the communities. We have to pay for early intervention. It's so many things wrapped up into that.
Oh, yes.
So it really has a societal benefit to be able to help some of these kids overcome their issues when they're young.
Yeah, particularly the families. I think that, to me,
Right. So we'll probably submit in 2022,
mhm,
early 2022, and my book should be out in November.
that's fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you, thank you.
Well,
I
it's
will send
great
you a
having you
copy.
on. I love the conversation.
Thank you, I appreciate
And,
everything.
it's so great to hear what you're doing, because whenever I talk and I'm not doing much investing at all these days, I'm sort of moving into my 19th career. But the one thing is, people say, well, if you started today, where would you be investing? And I said, I would 100% be investing in biotech, because I really do believe in the next 10 years, there's going to be such massive changes in medicine because of technology. And you're talking about where they're being nice to the male intern. Everyone for years looked at women through the lens of men's health, which is utterly absurd. And so, it is fascinating to see the changes in medicine, even from, walking into a hospital and them going like this and figuring out your temperature. And so, I'm really excited to see what happens in that world over the next decade, inclusive of mental health and help
Yes,
from
we have to
talking to
the mental
people.
health piece there. We can't just keep ignoring it, right? And we can't ignore that, and we can't ignore, learning disabilities in young children who ultimately get labeled as behavior problems.
Yes.
And that starts them down a road that's not good for them. We have to pay attention to those things.
Yeah, because you never get out.
Right, exactly,
All right.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, I enjoyed this very much.
Yes, me too. It was great
Okay,
talking to you.
all right,
Take
bye-bye.
care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.